The Black Death in Monasteries, Why So Many Monks Died. This is the story of how a single epidemic, arriving in England in the summer of 1348, killed approximately half of the country's monastic population within 2 years, and why the very things that made a monastery function as a community made it one of the most dangerous places in the country to be when the plague arrived. This is the full account of the Black Death in England's monasteries. The plague arrived on English soil at Weymouth Harbour on the Dorset coast in early August of 1348. A ship from Gascony carried it, and the Chronicle of the Grey Friars at King's Lynn places the landing shortly before June 24th of that year, the feast of St. John the Baptist. From Weymouth it moved through Dorset, Somerset and Devon with a speed that contemporary accounts struggled to explain. Bristol fell by August 15th, London before the end of the year. By spring of 1349, the epidemic had reached its maximum intensity in England, killing through the whole population without regard to rank, age or vocation, though not without regard to circumstance. And the circumstances of monastic life placed monks at particular risk from nearly every angle. The disease was Yersinia pestis, the bacterium responsible for plague. It spread through the bites of infected fleas carried by rats and, in its pneumonic form, directly through the air from person to person. Symptoms arrived quickly: fever between 38 and 41 degrees Celsius, severe headache, aching joints, nausea, and the characteristic buboes, swollen, infected lymph nodes in the armpits, neck, and groin that oozed pus and bled when opened. Left untreated, approximately 80% of victims died within 8 days. Medieval medicine had no treatment and no accurate explanation. The plague was attributed to the wrath of God, the alignment of the planets, and bad air, miasma, rising from the earth. None of these explanations produced an effective response. England's monastic population in 1348 numbered approximately 17,500 monks, nuns and friars distributed across roughly 500 religious houses. Within the roughly 2-year period of the epidemic's worst phase, historians estimate that not far short of half of them died. The mortality among friars ran higher than among monks and nuns, because friars moved through the world, preaching in towns, hearing confessions, attending the sick, in ways that enclosed monks did not. But enclosed monks were not protected by their enclosure. The structure of monastic life created specific vulnerabilities that a monk could not avoid simply by staying within the walls. The first was proximity. Every choir monk in a medieval monastery slept in the same dormitory on straw mattresses in rows without physical separation. They ate every meal in the same refectory at tables arranged in long lines. They gathered in the same chapter house every morning, assembled in the same church for 8 prayer services every day, processed through the same cloister walks. When one person in the community carried the plague pathogen, the layout of the institution was designed to maximize contact between that person and everyone else. The practices that built communal solidarity also built a nearly perfect transmission environment for an airborne disease. The second vulnerability was the gate. Monasteries were not closed institutions. They received a constant flow of visitors, pilgrims seeking hospitality, travelers needing rest, the sick arriving at the armory, royal delegations, merchants supplying goods, legal agents, and local poor receiving alms. Every person who passed through the gate was a potential source of infection, and the rule's requirement to receive every guest as if receiving Christ himself meant that turning people away was not an option the rule endorsed. The infirmary made it worse. Sick travelers who arrived at the gate were transferred to the infirmary when their condition required it, placing the monastery's own sick monks in the same building as incoming carriers. The infirmarius attended all of them. The theological crisis was immediate. The plague arrived as an event that the Church's existing framework of explanation could not accommodate without strain. If God sent the plague as punishment, what had the monks done? These were men who spent 8 periods of every day in prayer, who fasted, who followed the most rigorous penitential regime available in medieval society. If they were dying as fast as, or faster than, the secular world around them, what did prayer and penance actually accomplish? Some contemporaries responded by intensifying religious practice. The flagellants, groups who processed through towns publicly whipping themselves as collective penance, appeared across Europe in this period, drawing crowds and generating controversy within the Church. Pope Clement VI condemned the movement in 1349. Inside monasteries, the response was more individual. Monks who survived the first wave continued the divine office, sometimes with drastically reduced numbers, sometimes after watching their entire community collapse around them within weeks. Mortality among the wider English clergy ran catastrophically high. The Church lost nearly 40% of its priests during the epidemic. Some towns saw 90% of their parish priests die. 3 archbishops of Canterbury died in a single year. The minimum ordination age was lowered from 25 to 20 specifically to address the shortage of clergy, which meant the Church's response to the crisis included accepting younger and less formed priests into positions of sacramental authority at the very moment when the demand for those services was at its highest. The aftermath for the monasteries that survived was long and difficult. Houses that had lost half their population faced an immediate recruitment problem. The knowledge, skills, and institutional memory embedded in the dead monks could not be replaced quickly. A scriptorium that had operated at full capacity lost scribes who had spent years mastering their craft. An infirmary that had relied on the accumulated medical knowledge of experienced monks lost those monks. The agricultural operations that had fed the community depended on lay brothers and servants who died in the same proportions as everyone else. Smaller monasteries that had been marginal operations before 1348 often did not recover. A community of a dozen monks, down to 3 or 4 survivors, might simply close its doors. Some houses were entirely wiped out, their buildings standing empty until absorbed by neighboring institutions or falling into decay. The monasteries that survived carried the damage for generations. They were smaller, operated with thinner knowledge reserves, and faced a recruitment environment transformed by the plague's social effects. The broader population had contracted. The pool of men and women available for monastic life had shrunk. The social prestige that had drawn families to place children in monasteries as oblates or donate younger sons to religious orders had not disappeared. But the world those donations came from had changed permanently. The network of 500 English houses and 17,500 people that had existed on January 1, 1348, never fully rebuilt itself. The English monasteries continued operating until the dissolution under Henry VIII between 1536 and 1541, but in diminished form, and much of the diminishment traced directly to the 2 years between 1348 and 1350, when the plague moved through the dormitories and refectories, and chapter houses and infirmaries of the most systematically organized communities in the country, and left nothing in its wake that could be restored simply by waiting. To make the Black Death in monasteries? Why so many monks died feel real. Imagine the monastery before sunrise. When the walls are dark, the yard is cold, and the community is already moving according to rules older than any living brother. The point of this world was not comfort, it was continuity. Every corridor, office, object and gesture existed because someone before them had decided that prayer could only survive if it was protected by habit, labor, discipline, and money. The first thing a visitor would notice was how organized the place felt. The infirmary hall led toward the herb garden, while the cemetery edge connected the spiritual center to the working heart of the house. Nothing was placed at random. Even when buildings had grown unevenly over centuries, the monastery still tried to behave like a map of Christian order, with the church at the center and practical service spaces arranged around it like organs around a body. That order depended on people with sharply different duties. Infirmarians carried authority, but sick monks and anxious villagers often made the daily machinery work. Gravediggers handled tasks that choir monks might barely see, and physician monks revealed how closely the monastery was tied to the outside world. Medieval monastic life was communal, but it was never socially flat. Rank-shaped where a person stood, ate, slept, spoke, and was remembered after death. The material world mattered because it made obedience visible. Linen bandages could represent discipline as clearly as a sermon. Herb bundles carried memory. Bleeding bowls protected property and boundaries. Grave markers served the body, while wax-sealed letters reminded every monk that holiness was supposed to be practiced through ordinary things. A monastery was not an escape from material life. It was material life arranged to point toward eternity. The 14th century made that arrangement harder to maintain. Bad harvests, war taxation, changing labour markets, and epidemic disease all pressed against religious houses that had once seemed almost permanent. Some monasteries became poorer, others became more bureaucratic and defensive. Many tried to preserve ancient customs while quietly adapting to a world in which rents, wages, mortality, and local resentment no longer behaved the way earlier generations had expected. This is why monastic sickness, fear, and crisis cannot be understood as a single custom or curiosity. It touched the monastery's schedule, its finances, its architecture, and its reputation. A decision made in the chapter house could change what happened in the kitchen. A shortage in the grange could affect the refectory. A dispute at the gate could become a legal entry in an account roll. Inside the walls, spiritual life and administration constantly leaned on each other. The documentary evidence is fragmentary, but it is not silent. Mortality lists show how officials counted, corrected, and justified decisions. Medical recipes preserve the language of obligation. Burial archaeology let historians reconstruct spaces that have lost their roofs, screens, and painted surfaces. Chronicle entries reveal the small details that grand narratives often miss. The result is a world that can be studied through stone, ink, bone, soil, and habit. A normal day brought the subject down from theory into tired bodies. Bells interrupted sleep. Cold floors met bare or sandaled feet. Voices rose in chant before breakfast. Hands lifted tools, books, bowls, keys, or spades. The same brother might pray with intense devotion in one hour and argue over supplies in another. Medieval monks were not symbols moving through a perfect religious machine. They were human beings trying to live inside one. The emotional tone of that life was quieter than modern imagination often allows. Devotion did not always look like ecstasy. Fear did not always look like panic. Authority did not always shout. A bowed head, a careful hand, a delayed answer, or a tired walk through the cloister could carry the whole weight of the institution. The monastery trained people to control their expressions, but it could not remove exhaustion, ambition, irritation, grief, or hope. The surrounding village understood the monastery in practical terms. It was a landlord, employer, lender, customer, court, school, hospital, granary, and sacred destination. Some locals depended on it for alms or work. Others resented its privileges. Tenants might bring grain, wool, fish, rents, complaints or lawsuits to its officers. The walls separated monks from lay society, but they never fully cut the monastery off from the economy that fed it. Women also belonged in this story, even when surviving records preserve them unevenly. Nunneries followed their own versions of enclosure, discipline, estate management, manuscript use, hospitality, and prayer. Noble women could become patrons, widows could retire near religious houses, and female servants often worked in outer spaces connected to large institutions, a history of medieval monastic life that only imagines men in choir stalls misses part of the social world that made the system possible. The architecture amplified every rule. Thick walls controlled temperature and sound. Narrow stairs guided movement. Screens separated spaces according to rank and ritual purity. Doorways made obedience physical by deciding who could cross and when. Light from high windows could make a church feel otherworldly. But the same complex still needed drains, kitchens, storage rooms, latrines, workshops, stables, and roofs that did not leak during winter rain. When historians describe monasteries as wealthy, that wealth should not be pictured only as treasure. It was stored in land, rights, animals, tools, harvests, rents, mills, fish ponds, books, roofs, and legal privileges. A monastery could be rich in property and still short of ready cash. It could own many acres and still struggle to repair a damaged wall. Medieval wealth was powerful, but it was often slow, local, seasonal, and bound to obligations. Conflict entered through small doors. A missing key, an unpaid rent, an undisciplined novice, a sick cellarer, a forged document, a spoiled harvest, or a rumor about misconduct could disturb the whole community. The rule promised stability, but stability had to be produced again and again by meetings, punishments, negotiations, prayers, repairs, and written records. The calm surface of monastic life was the result of constant maintenance. The same is true of knowledge. Monasteries preserved learning, but they also filtered it. Books were copied because someone valued them, paid for materials, assigned labor, and protected them from damp, theft, fire, and insects. Medical recipes, estate accounts, sermons, saints' lives, legal privileges, and musical notation all survived through institutions that had reasons to keep them. What remains from the Middle Ages is partly a record of what monasteries chose to remember. There were limits to the ideal. Monks could be lazy, proud, frightened, corrupt, generous, brilliant, lonely, or deeply sincere. Abbots could be holy reformers or ambitious managers. Lay brothers could sustain a house and still be treated as socially inferior. Guests could receive charity and still be ranked by status. The monastery preached humility, but it operated in a society obsessed with hierarchy, land, lineage, and visible honor. The story should be told without fantasy. The fear was real enough because ordinary people had to interpret suffering with the tools their century gave them. That is the key to avoiding both romantic myth and cheap scandal. The monastery was neither a peaceful museum nor a secret dungeon by nature. It was a living medieval institution, capable of beauty, discipline, exploitation, care, bureaucracy, learning, and fear, sometimes in the same week and sometimes in the same room. By the late 14th century, many houses were living with the consequences of plague and demographic shock. Fewer workers meant higher wages outside the cloister and more pressure on estates that depended on customary labor. Recruitment could become harder. Buildings designed for larger communities could feel oversized. Old routines continued, but the people performing them knew that the world beyond the gate had changed in ways no customary could fully solve. That pressure makes the subject more interesting, not less. The Black Death in Monasteries, Why So Many Monks Died, shows a society trying to turn belief into durable practice. It reveals how medieval people measured time, controlled bodies, organized labor, stored value, handled danger, and explained suffering. It also shows how much of daily life happened in the gap between an ideal written in Latin and the stubborn realities of mud, hunger, illness, weather, money, and tired hands. If we could stand there for one quiet minute, the scene would not feel like a fantasy version of the Middle Ages. It would smell of smoke, damp wool, wax, bread, herbs, ink, animals, and stone after rain. It would sound like bells, sandals, pages, hinges, water, and low voices. And beneath all of it would be the central rhythm of the monastery, repeated prayer holding together a complicated human machine. The final lesson of the Black Death in Monasteries, Why So Many Monks Died, is that medieval monastic life was built from details. No single detail explains the whole institution, but together they show how a religious community tried to survive across generations. Stone gave it shelter, rules gave it shape, land gave it income, memory gave it authority, and daily repetition gave it the feeling of permanence even when the century around it was unstable. Another way to see the Black Death in Monasteries, Why So Many Monks Died, is through timekeeping. Medieval people did not experience the day as a neutral sequence of hours. Bells divided attention, and each division carried a duty. In the monastery, time was claimed before the individual could claim it for himself. That made illness, care, and medieval fear feel less like an occasional activity, and more like a permanent condition, something that shaped memory through repetition. The infirmarian had to think about the subject in practical terms. Ideals mattered, but someone still had to decide who held the key, who carried the message, who repaired the damage, who paid the worker, who apologized to the patron, and who corrected the mistake. Medieval administration was often slow and personal, but it could be surprisingly exact when property, obedience, or reputation was at stake. Inside the infirmary, the difference between a rule and a lived experience became obvious. A rule could be written in a few lines, but living it required washing linens, preparing herbs, watching symptoms, comforting the dying, and recording losses. It required patience when the body was tired, clarity when records were confusing, and humility when a younger or lower-ranking person had to do work that kept the whole house alive. There was also a seasonal rhythm. Winter made stone rooms bitter and shortened useful daylight. Spring brought mud, lambing, repairs, and new agricultural calculations. Summer offered long working days but also heat, flies, and the danger of spoiled food or sickness. Autumn brought rents, harvests, storing, brewing, slaughtering, and accounting. The monastery looked timeless, but its workload changed with the weather. Sound shaped the experience as much as sight. The bell did not merely announce prayer, it controlled movement across the entire enclosure. Footsteps in a cloister could reveal whether a brother was late. A cough in choir could expose weakness. A door latch in the night could become suspicious. Even silence had texture, because a silent community still produced the noises of labor, illness, hunger, and discipline. The danger of contagion and helplessness explains many choices that may seem excessive now. Medieval communities had fewer buffers against breakdown. A lost document could threaten income. A damaged roof could ruin stored grain. A sick official could leave accounts unfinished. A scandal could reduce donations. A failed harvest could turn charity into triage. In that context, strict procedure was not just conservatism, it was a survival tool. The outside world entered through negotiation. Families, gravediggers, healers, and frightened villagers did not simply admire the monastery from a distance. They bargained with it, depended on it, complained about it, and sometimes feared it. The gate was therefore more than an entrance. It was the place where enclosed religion met hunger, debt, labor, travel, law, and local memory. Objects carried authority because so much of medieval life depended on physical proof. A linen bandage could settle a question that no spoken memory could settle. A seal could make an order travel beyond the person who gave it. A written list could outlive the monk who wrote it. A stored tool could preserve a technique. The monastery survived partly by turning trust into objects that could be checked. Modern viewers often look for the most dramatic image, but the deeper story is usually in maintenance. Someone swept the floor before a ceremony. Someone trimmed the lamp. Someone counted loaves, folded cloth, patched a shoe, sharpened a knife, aired a book, cleaned a drain, or carried water. Without that hidden work, the famous rituals of medieval monastic life would have collapsed within days. The evidence from medical recipes, chronicles, and burial evidence asks for patience. It rarely gives a perfect scene. Instead, it offers a rent payment here, a correction there, a broken wall, a missing servant, a purchase of candles, a note about discipline, or a complaint about behavior. Put together, those fragments reveal a dense human system where holiness was pursued through countless practical decisions. The atmosphere would have been unmistakably physical: herbs, sweat, beeswax, wet earth, and stale rushes. The medieval monastery was not clean in a modern, clinical sense, but it was ordered according to its own priorities. Some spaces were washed, swept, and guarded with care. Others were smoky, muddy, noisy, or crowded. The contrast between sacred order and bodily reality was part of the experience. That contrast is what gives the Black Death in monasteries, why so many monks died, its lasting power as a historical subject. It shows people trying to build a disciplined life in a world that kept resisting discipline. Bodies became hungry. Buildings aged, money ran short, novices made mistakes, rulers demanded taxes, weather ruined plans, and death entered without permission. Still the bell rang, the office began again, and the community tried to continue.